Whoa, you weren't kidding when you said you had a lot of material about this case.
Yeah,
That's
it's quite the rabbit hole, actually.
It seems like every time you pull a thread on this whole IBC and PMLA thing, you just unravel a whole new layer of complexity.
It's true.
It's fascinating, though, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially, for someone like me who likes to, get into the weeds of these things.
Well, and it's so relevant
Yeah,
to anyone involved in insolvency proceedings these days.
100%.
You really have to understand how these two laws are interacting.
Yeah, because looking at just, this stack of legal excerpts, webinars, that court judgment you sent me,
Right.
it's clear you're dealing with a situation where these two laws are sort of on a collision course.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so tricky.
It's like,
You've got two ships passing in the night.
yes.
Yeah.
And they're trying to avoid,
Yeah.
a crash, but it's like, are they even seeing each other,
And both of them are important ships, right?
No.
Both laws serve a crucial purpose.
Okay, so before we even get into, the conflict between them,
Yeah.
we should probably take a step back and make sure everyone understands,
Oh,
the what's and the why of each one, right?
yeah, absolutely. Let's start with the IBC.
Okay.
At its core, it's designed to be a lifeline for companies in distress.
Mm-hmm.
It's about trying to maximize the value of their assets for the creditors, of course. But
Yeah.
here's the thing that I find really interesting.
Okay.
It's not just about liquidation. It's also very much focused on trying to revive the business if at all possible.
Right, so it's not just about...
It's not just a death knell.
Yeah.
It's trying
read.
It's trying to breathe life back into it if it can.
Find a way to keep it going, right?
Exactly. And sometimes that even means altering the traditional pecking order for government dues, which I always find fascinating.
See, that's what really stood out to me when I was looking through some of these webinar transcripts.
Yeah.
Because it's almost like saying to the government, hey, we know you're owed money,
Right.
but maybe, just maybe, letting this company recover is ultimately better for everyone in the long run.
It's a really interesting shift, isn't it? It's a move away from a purely creditors' rights approach to something that recognizes the broader economic impact.
Right, because if a company goes under, jobs are lost.
Exactly.
Tax revenue disappears.
It has a ripple effect.
It's a whole thing.
It really does.
So we have the IBC over here focused on, rescue, revival. But then you've got PMLA, which seems to take a very different approach, right?
Right. It's more like something from
Mm.
Financial Watchdog.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. PMLA's mission is to cut off the lifeblood of criminal enterprises by preventing money laundering.
Right. And that's where I think a lot of people get tripped up.
Yeah.
Because they think of money laundering as oh, I've got this black money and I need to make it white.
Right. Right. Just a simple conversion.
Yeah. But it's so much more than that.
It is. And one of the legal excerpts you sent over actually had a really good line about this.
Oh, was it the one that said,
Let me see if I can remember.
PMLA casts a wide net? Yes, that's the one.
Okay, go on. What did it say? I'm paraphrasing, of course.
No, you've got it exactly. It said PMLA encompasses not just the conversion process, but the concealment, possession, acquisition, or use of proceeds of crime.
It's about following the money, right? Wherever it may lead.
Precisely. It's about preventing criminals from enjoying the fruits of their illegal activities, regardless of how they try to clean the money or where they stash it.
So you're not just going after the initial crime, you're going after any way they're benefiting from it.
Exactly.
Wow.
It's a much broader approach.
It is. It's fascinating, but it also seems like that's where things start to get messy when you bring in something like the IBC.
Right, because what happens when those two goals, revival and crime fighting, start to clash?
Exactly. And we'll get into all that right after this. All right, so this is where it all gets really interesting.
It does.
Because now we've got these two powerful laws, right? Each with their own purpose, their own objectives. But sometimes those objectives, I imagine, clash.
They absolutely can.
So, help me wrap my head around this.
Okay.
Let's say there's a company.
Yeah.
They're going through this IBC process. They're on the path to recovery. Things are looking up.
Right.
And then, bam, the enforcement directorate comes knocking with a PMLA notice and freezes their assets.
Right. That's the tension we're talking about.
How does that even work?
Well, the way the ED often sees it, they view the IBC as a potential loophole.
Really?
Yeah, a way for people to escape the consequences of financial crimes.
So they're thinking, oh, you're just trying to use this IBC thing to get out of trouble.
Exactly. They see a company going through resolution and think it might be a way to legitimize money that was obtained illegally.
And so they step in and say, hold on a minute. not so fast.
Precisely.
And this isn't just theoretical, right? You mentioned a case earlier, the JSW Steel case.
Right. That's a perfect example of this clash playing out in the real world.
So what happened there?
Essentially, JSW Steel was undergoing the resolution process. A plan had actually been approved.
Okay.
But then the ED stepped in and attached some of their assets, citing PMLA.
So even though the company was, like, on the verge of making a comeback, they still got hit with this PMLA action.
That's right, and that's why this whole issue is so contentious.
Because on the one hand, you've got the IBC saying, let's save this company. But then you've got PMLA coming in and potentially derailing that entire process.
Exactly, and it raises all sorts of questions about which law takes precedence.
Right, because if a company is trying to restructure, get back on its feet, but it's constantly worried about its assets being frozen, it's like, how can they move forward?
It creates a lot of uncertainty, that's for sure.
And speaking of uncertainty, what about these non-obstant clauses I keep hearing about?
Ah, yes, those are at the heart of this legal tug-of-war.
Okay, so for those of us who aren't legal experts, break it down.
Basically, both the IBC and PMLA have these clauses written into them.
Okay.
And what they essentially say is, this law overrides any other conflicting legislation.
So it's like they each have a trump card, and they're both trying to play.
It becomes a question of which law has the upper hand.
So, I mean, how do you even begin to decide that? Does the IBC win out because it was enacted more recently?
That's one argument, and it's one that supporters of the IBC often make.
They said, look, this is the newer law. It should take precedence.
Exactly. But then you have the supporters of PMLA who argue that its specialized nature, the fact that it's specifically designed to combat serious financial crime, that gives it a certain weight.
Right. They're saying, we're not talking about just any old law here. This is about stopping criminals.
That's their argument, and it's a compelling one.
It is, and I can see both sides of it, to be honest.
Right. It's a complex issue with valid points being raised on both sides.
So is there anything within the IBC itself that offers companies some sort of protection from these PMLA interventions?
There is, actually. Section 32A of the IBC is designed to provide some immunity to the new management that comes in after a resolution plan is approved.
So they're basically saying, whatever happened in the past, that's not on you.
Right. It's meant to shield them from the past actions of the previous management.
Which makes sense, because otherwise, who would ever want to take on a company that's going through this?
Exactly. But there's a catch.
Isn't there always?
There often is. The protection offered by Section 32A is frequently debated in cases where the assets were attached before the resolution process even began.
So if the ED swoops in and freezes assets before the IBC process is officially underway, then that protection might not apply.
That's the gray area that's often contested in court.
It's all starting to sound like a bit of a legal minefield.
It can be, and that's why it's crucial to understand the nuances of these laws and how they interact.
Especially with those non-obstant clauses, it's like they create this constant tension.
A tension that often ends up being resolved in the courts.
Exactly. And speaking of the courts, there have been some recent judgments on this very issue that I think are worth diving into.
Absolutely. Those judgments provide some much-needed clarity in this complicated landscape.
So are there any, like, landmark cases or anything that would give us, like, a clearer picture of how this whole IBC PMLA thing is actually shaking out in the courts?
Well, there was a really important judgment that came out of the Bombay High Court just this past March.
Oh, yeah, I think I remember reading something about that.
It was the Shiv Chan case, Shiv Chan and others versus adjudicating authority under PMLA. And it involved a company that was in a pretty similar situation to what we were discussing earlier.
Like where the ED stepped in and froze assets?
Exactly. And it even happened before the IBC process had formally begun.
Oh, wow. So even further back in the timeline.
Right. So in this case, the Bombay High Court actually sided with the company.
They did?
They did. They upheld the resolution plan that had been agreed upon.
Okay.
And crucially, they ordered the release of those assets that had been frozen.
Wow, so that's a pretty big win for the IBC camp then, right?
It certainly seems to suggest a leaning in that direction.
Yeah.
But, and this is important to keep in mind, the legal landscape is rarely ever completely black and white.
Right, there are always going to be exceptions and nuances and all that.
Exactly. And in fact, there have also been judgments that went the other way, where the courts sided with PMLA's authority.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, there's the Sterling SEZ case, and then there's also the Bouchon Power and Steel case.
Okay, so it really does seem to depend on the specifics of each individual case.
It often does, and that's why having those non-obstant clauses in both laws just adds another layer of complexity.
Right, because it's like each law is saying, no, but really, I get to be the trump card.
Exactly, and it creates this constant tension, this uncertainty about which one will ultimately prevail.
Well, and you mentioned earlier that there are some cases currently pending before the Supreme Court.
Right, and those are going to be crucial in shaping how this whole IBC PMLA conflict plays out in the future.
Because whatever the Supreme Court decides will essentially set a precedent, right?
Exactly. Their judgments will have far-reaching implications for how these two laws are interpreted and applied going forward.
So for anyone who's involved in insolvency proceedings or who just likes to follow this kind of thing, those are the cases to watch.
Absolutely. They're going to be fascinating to follow.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to really break all of this down.
It's been my pleasure, really.
I always feel like I learned so much from our conversations.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Because, let's be honest, this stuff can get really complicated really quickly.
Oh, absolutely. And the last thing anyone wants is to be caught off guard by these legal complexities.
Exactly. So being informed, knowing your rights, understanding how these laws interact, that's really half the battle.
Couldn't agree more. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Well said, well said. And on that note, we'll wrap things up here, but be sure to join us next time for another deep dive into the world of Indian law and finance.